This episode is brought to you by Principles. Are there limits to the U.S. government's debt growth? What will happen if the debts are not curtailed? What should policymakers or investors do? Those are urgent questions that legendary investor and New York Times bestselling author Ray Dalio addresses in his new book, How Countries Go Broke: The Big Cycle. The book comes out in June and is available for pre-order today, wherever books are sold.
This is Let the Record Show, using common sense. Now, here are your hosts, Judge Richard Weinberg and Chairman Jesse Garcia.
Welcome back to Let the Record Show. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. With me is my good friend, esteemed colleague, Jesse Garcia. Jesse is the Vice Chair of the State Republican Party, County Chair of the Suffolk County Party. Welcome back, Jesse.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And with Jesse and me is our new best friend, Michael Davis. Michael Davis is quite a remarkable guy. He and I were having lunch last week together, and we were at a lunch for Jim Jordan, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and we were sitting opposite each other, and we started having a conversation. And while this conversation was going on, I said, my God, I have to commandeer this guy and put him on Let the Record Show. So that's why we got him here, Jesse, because I commandeered him. The first issue I want to raise is and there are a lot of interesting topics that Michael is well versed on, but I want to talk about something that's of great concern to me, and I think it's only getting worse, Jesse, and that's America divided. Why is that so important? Why is that so dangerous today in this dangerous world that we live in? What are your thoughts, Jesse?
Well, my thoughts, I think that about America being divided, unfortunately, as we look at that, I would say, and I would have to, unfortunately, look at it this way in terms of America divided. I believe it's a combination of different issues, and Michael will probably correct me, and I hope he does, because I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong on this. It's an issue where I don't believe our elected leaders are listening to their constituents any longer. I think they're listening to their special interests. I also believe that they're listening to their inner character defects of greed, power, and influence. And with that combination with powers such as big tech and advancing certain political philosophies while suppressing others, certainly the mainstream media that is no longer the independent voice of America any longer. They abuse the First Amendment. It's more of 24-hour of opinion news than actual straight news. And then we find out that in many cases they purposely slant the news, even though they're wrong, that there's a lot of distrust in America. And that's what is leading to this great divide. We have elected leaders on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, and they're speaking to their partisan positions. But I think that, we spoke before off air that we were going to speak a little bit about George Washington. One of the things that, George Washington spoke about and that he felt that was important for his role in this new republic was about unity and not division, that was necessary for this democratic republic to survive. I think that the combination of big tech, a slanted mainstream media, corporate interests that are more interested in the bottom line and dealing with America's enemies as opposed to our allies, like is China. And of course, those extreme wings, like the progressive movement on the Democratic side, that is hijacking the whole narrative of American exceptionalism and our role in this. And we have leaders like Biden that are fearful of an electorate and are attacking to that way and basing policy not for the greater good, but for the appeasement of a small minority of their political party. That, I believe, is what's leading to our divisiveness, and we need to break through that. We need, like you and I and Michael and others and Eric and others that we've had on this show, to talk more about the common sense approach to governance and common sense approach to a discourse amongst different opinions.
That's well said. Michael, so I'll turn that over to you now on America Divided, Why That Matters in a Dangerous World. And I want you to instruct us about the life and legacy of your good friend, the late, great Senator Joseph Lieberman, who I say was a model for all of us.
Sure. So I think as you parse out what it means to be divided, it's worth stepping all the way back, sort of forest for the trees, on understanding sui bono, who benefits from these sort of divisions. There's a lot of external variables, certainly social media. The debate we're having on TikTok now is instructive in that way about who seeks to divide us how. But when you stretch all this out, one of the ways that you can process this a little differently is to try and think about the world in the way that flat earthers used to think about it. I think a lot of folks think of people on the very far left, sort of people who are dishonest, sort of very ugly people in the sense of their politics and the way they sow division, the Jamal Bowmans of the world, who are peddling some pretty divisive stuff with intentionality. And then there's people on the far right who seek to try and overthrow their party's leaders. You have these divisions in the extremes that are hard. And I think a lot of people think of those through the lens of a flat earther. But the reality is that it's really more spherical. And people on the far right and the far left are probably at like 359 degrees and 2 degrees, right? They're very close to each other in the radical extremes. And most people want to live in the middle, but the electoral politics of primary systems tend to cater to people who will reliably turn out in low turnout primary elections. And so you end up with a system where most people are unhappy with their candidates, but they end up with them because we have a pretty radicalized primary system in low turnout states. And so when you talk about how division functions, it's obviously a poison across society. And you bring it to it's timely to speak about Joe, who was a great man, an independent in every sense of that word, and that he would go to where his moral compass pushed him. He actually, after he retired from public service, moved to Riverdale, where I live, and we sat near each other and frequently had a chance to sit together in synagogue and talk about the world. And one of the lessons that we talked about is the nature of change and the danger of doing divisive things. And there's this topic we would talk about the filibuster. And it's funny, the filibuster had a name that was familiar to a lot of people who were not particularly active in politics, right? The idea that you would change the rule on a 60-vote threshold for various things was called the nuclear option. That's a pretty interesting name for a parliamentary procedure, right? The nuclear option, that connotes destruction at some scale. And Joe would talk about how you would have lunch with the other folks in the Senate on the other side, and you'd have policy. And I think people forget that the removal of appropriation spending, so-called pork, would be removed from the political process by dint of law and rule at around the same time as Harry Reid originally sort of pushed the button on that famous speech where for a minute and a half he sat on the floor and said, politics changed and our country has to change with it. Judge Weinberg, we talked the other day about how the average Supreme Court nominee through most of history would get 80, 90% of the vote in the Senate. And today it's almost impossible to imagine someone getting by more than a squeak. And part of the reason for that was, by dint of the calendar and the map, it's pretty hard for one party to have 60 votes in the Senate. And so you would have political appointees to the courts that would surprise you sometime with their politics because you would put fairly moderate, down the fairway, Lieberman-style thinkers in these roles. And today that ideological divide has changed so much. And part of what you discuss is the Senate changed when you changed that, because if I don't need your vote and I have nothing to trade you for, you end up with the sort of gridlock where spending $1 billion for a single Senate seat makes sense. And folks like Joe, who operated in a different time, I think most of us recognize and romanticize that environment of a certain level of seriousness, of serious people having serious discussions pervaded. And his loss as a human, as a person, as a wonderful man is tragic. But the departure of folks like Joe from our politics, I think, is even more so, because this divisiveness is just so poison. Well,
one of the wonderful things about Joe Lieberman is, and I knew this about him, and our good friend Michael Davis pointed out about Lieberman, he would constantly have lunch with his colleagues in the Senate, both Republicans and Democrats. And he would do this on a regular basis. It wasn't an isolated instance. So they got to know each other as human beings and to find out the human traits and the common shared values, and that's very, very important. And that's lost today when everything is about, a quick spin or a soundbite on a talk show or on an interview. And when you lose the ability to think issues through, look at the law of unintended consequences, and one of the great, hopefully the unintended consequence, unless you're totally an insurrectionist or a revolutionary, the unintended consequence to me, Jesse and Michael, of this division is internal division makes us weaker, and we're now in the most dangerous portion of history that I have ever lived through. We have enemies from the Middle East led by Iran. You have the Chinese who are on the march. You have the violation of the Monroe Doctrine, where you have commerce and plants with Chinese and Iranian assets in our hemisphere. You have Russia, which is going through an imperialistic regime under Putin. These are dangerous times, and they have to be confronted carefully and seriously. And if all you're interested in is a soundbite, and all if you're interested in is getting your partisan agenda accomplished or holding on to power, as Jesse points out, it's all about ambition and power and not about service and love of country. In that dangerous world, our enemies can overcome us. And that's the problem. So the life and legacy of Joe Lieberman is he was a model of bipartisanship. And he's one of the founders of this No Labels group, which at the beginning I thought was a very interesting idea to give us a choice between the two parties. The problem with No Labels is when it came push to shove, and you know this, Jesse, far better than I, when it came push to shove on Kevin McCarthy, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and the crazy 8 Republicans, the radical right Republicans, subverted him, and to try to get to lose the speakership by moving to vacate the chair. The Democrats, many of whom were members of the coalition that was supposed to be bipartisan, the No Labels group, what did they do? They all voted in lockstep with the Democratic Party against McCarthy, even though McCarthy worked in a bipartisan way. So they sold out, and they lost the integrity and the vision of the group that Lieberman so much devoted himself to. All right, I want to raise another issue with you, gentlemen. I want to talk about the tyranny of experts. Now, the tyranny of experts is something I find very, very interesting as a lawyer. And I'll just set it up, and I'll turn this over to Michael. Fundamentally, the Supreme Court of the United States, in a case called the Chevron case, Chevron doctrine, has deference by the courts to the so-called expertise of the administrative agencies, and they're experts there. So they have broad powers devoted and given to administrative agencies, and then they're supposed to create rules to carry out the legislative mandate of the legislation. But the problem is, and Michael can talk about this for a couple of minutes before we take our break, the problem is, are these experts really experts, and why are we being so deferential to them? Michael.
Sure. So without touching the edge of litigation past or present that we've had against the city of New York, where sort of surprise, surprise, there's a fair amount of corruption. One of the things that you'll find is that the development of canons of law and theories of law around administrative deference, I think, was very well intentioned. The idea that a legislator elected by the body politic broadly would have niche expertise enough to craft law without special interests pushing against that law to get it right was sort of strained credulity. And this idea became, let's create frameworks and we'll have true experts make law in areas where they have domain expertise. And that makes a lot of sense as a framing issue until you understand that the nature of who gets the anointing, so the Davidic anointing of expertise, is a political exercise. And so by way of example, if someone is appointed to the Board of Standards and Appeals in a purely political process who doesn't have any particular expertise on one issue or another, they are granted the judicial canon of deference with the extreme, and in subsequent legal challenges, a litigant who's trying to go up against the machinery of government has essentially an insurmountable barrier because the courts decided following the federal model of the Chevron case, which we can talk to a little bit, which it seems likely will be overturned this upcoming summer by the Supreme Court, those administrative deference proceedings lead to a pretty sticky situation for people where someone who doesn't have any expertise the day before they're appointed in a political process, the day after is now deemed an expert by no gaining of knowledge or expertise. But their opinion, as long as it's threshold defensible, is deferred to in all subsequent court proceedings. And you can imagine the level of mischief that ensues when people find themselves bound by rulemakers who are treated as if they have legitimate expertise in something when they may or may not actually have that. And across society, we see this sort of mischief propagate because people feel like they're just trying to push against a mountain. They can't move it because the deck is stacked such that the threshold they would need to get to prevail in whatever proceeding or persecution they feel is essentially insurmountable for them.
All right, we're taking a break. We'll be back in a few moments. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. With me is Chairman Jesse Garcia of the Republican Party and our special guest, Michael Davis, who's a founding partner of the Plymouth Group, an investment group and a real estate group, as well as the director of the Council for a Secure America, which is a group dedicated to protecting and defending this great country of ours. We'll be back in a moment with more of Let the Record Show.
Let the Record Show is on the air.
This episode is brought to you by Factor. Optimize your nutrition this year with Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal service. Factor's fresh, never-frozen meals are dietitian-approved, ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Choose from 40 weekly options across 8 dietary preferences, like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. Eat smarter at factormeals.com/listen50 and use code listen50 for 50% off, plus free shipping on your first box. Factormeals.com/listen50, code listen50. Terms and conditions apply.
Experience a progressive lens engineered with AI from Essilor, powered by individual measurements of your visual behavior. A lens personalized to you by an Essilor expert. Discover Verilux XR Track and enjoy instantly sharp vision in motion and seamless transitions from near to far. Find your local Essilor expert today at Essilor.com.
This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. Psst. Healthcare pros, word's out, and it's too good to keep quiet. Look, LinkedIn is revolutionizing job hunting, making it possible to search by specialty, shift preference, and salary. Endless scrolling is out. Whether it's a mental health therapist or dental hygienist, finding the perfect role is faster and easier than ever. Head to linkedin.com/healthcare and start your search today.
Clorox Sentiva smells like lavender. Cleans like Clorox. And feels like...
All right, that could go on for a while. Experience the long-lasting freshness of Clorox Sentiva. Available in Clorox Sentiva Lavender Scented Bleach. Use as directed.
This is Let the Record Show. Now, here are your hosts, Judge Richard Weinberg and Suffolk County Republican Committee Chairman Jesse Garcia.
We're back on Let the Record Show. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. With me is Chairman Jesse Garcia of the Republican Party, and our special guest, Michael Davis, who's the founding partner of the Plymouth Group, an investment group and real estate group, as well as the founder of the Council for a Secure America, a patriotic group dedicated to saving our values and our institutions and protecting America. Jesse, I want to start this off with you. I've been very, very upset about the death of the officer who is one of your neighbors out on Long Island. And we keep seeing the total abysmal absence of an intelligent, rational response to the problem of criminality and violence. And they keep massaging numbers. They say everything is safer, everything's better. Number one, the numbers don't justify that because arrests aren't being made. And when they're made, they're not being prosecuted. And when they are being prosecuted, they're being pled down. This is a disaster for not only New York City and New York State, but for the whole country. You have an epidemic of lawlessness. And I'm particularly upset about the leadership of the state legislature, from Carl Hastie, the Speaker, and Andrew Stewart-Cousins, the Majority Leader of the Senate, because they are the ones who foster this whole system on us in New York State. Not only is it not working, but they keep saying it's the greatest thing since sliced bread and there's nothing wrong, and they're going to continue it because putting people in jail doesn't deter crime. What are your thoughts about all these issues, Jesse?
I think that, number one, we have an entire history of this republic and an entire history of society that jails and imprisonment does work. It protects society, and in some cases, and hopefully in more cases, you have our state leaders who are doubling down on those policies like cashless bails. And here's what the signal is. When arrests are made, and it's a turnstile type of law enforcement where an hour later, that same perpetrator of a violent crime is released in the streets with no bail, it empowers criminals, while at the same time, you've taken judicial discretion away from judges, you've taken away the tools from prosecutors, and you've taken away the power of the police officer on the street. Criminals and people who are going to do bad things or be lured to do bad things are going to know that there is no consequence to their crime. That's why businesses are closing. That's why some businesses who remain open still are locking their goods up, because people are walking in, smashing and grabbing and walking out, because these criminals are allowed to do this in the state of New York because of the progressive Democrats in Albany and in the city with impunity. And here's the other issue. I applaud the people who actually stood up to Governor Hochul and made her feel the wrath of the blood that's on their hands, of the state leaders and Governor Hochul, of Detective Dillard, because it's their policies that led to this issue. And you know what? You can say and massage your numbers all you want, your stats all you want, but even you can't massage them too good. Just in the reclassification of reports just today, from April 2 of 2023 to April 2 of 2024, murders which came in at 391 are 4 more than a year than they were in 2022. Rapes that finished at 1465 are up 10 from 2022. Reports of robberies are up 32% from the same time period. It goes on and on and on. We have established a community of lawlessness that has put law-abiding citizens on the defensive and may be unsafe. This is a derelict of duty and a rejection of the oath that these elected officials have taken. And if there was ever a state that needed a recall provision.
Michael, your thoughts?
There's this analogy people like to talk about boiling a frog, and that if you were to throw a frog into a pot of boiling water, it would freak out. But if you place a frog into a pot of cold water and slowly boil it, because they're cold-blooded, they would acclimate, and eventually they would just sit there and sort of, as a sheep to the slaughter, so to speak, just perish in the pot because they don't notice they're being boiled. I think so much of the experience that the citizenry of New York has around crime has sort of been one of these boil the frog exercises. The other day I was at dinner with a family member, I won't say who because they didn't give me permission to, but it was a woman who's of somewhat of an advanced age who was sucker punched on 94th and Broadway while walking in the street. And I said, "Did you call the police?" And her answer was astonishing. She said, "Why would I bother?" And I want to let that sit for a moment. It's a family member. It's someone I know quite well. She was so convinced that there was no point in even reporting it that, Jesse, when you talk about the crime stats, those are the ones that are reported. But the degree of lawlessness that's pursued leaves everyone sort of viscerally knowing that they're unsafe. We owned a convenience store in one of our shopping centers that went dark recently. And because as a landlord, sometimes you get what's called a percentage of sales. We knew their sales were quite good. We knew they were paying in rent. And so the store was viable. And so we said, "Why are you closing? They've got to pay us rent for years to not run a store." And their answer was, "This just doesn't work anymore. There's too much theft. There's too much crime." And so I think so many people listening to this will have experiences where they know they feel the same, that what's going around feels so chaotic to them that everyone understands that something is deeply, deeply wrong with it. And it culminates with New York's bravest, right? Our best people going to a routine traffic stop and having their lives snuffed out by someone who shouldn't be here, who should have been in jail, and anyone with any sense knows this. and that somehow our leaders choose to be blind to that and to pretend that the citizenry feels safe and feels good. It's such a dereliction of duty that it's almost shocking to the moral conscience. This shouldn't be about politics. I don't understand how anybody could look at what's happening to crime in this city and to the general unease and to the degradation of quality of life and say they're okay with this and say, the status quo is working great. It's almost incomprehensible.
Well, Michael Goodwin, in a column in the New York Post this week, went out of his way to say that, in essence, Carl Hastie, as Speaker of the Assembly, is unfit to hold the office and he should get off the stage because he doesn't understand that one of the key elements of the criminal justice system is deterrence. And one of the key things when Speaker Peter Vallone worked with the Dinkins administration, we created the program of Safe Streets, Safe City, and that gave Rudy Giuliani, a great mayor, the opportunity to govern successfully, followed by another great mayor, Michael Bloomberg, to govern successfully. So we had 20 years of good public safety and a sense of order. That was because there was a perception that government understood what the problem was, and government was willing to do the right thing to protect the citizenry. The fact of the matter is that without fulfilling the obligation to protect your citizens, government has no moral authority. The leaders have no moral authority to govern. That's the first principle of government. You have to protect your people. If you're not protecting your people, you're failing your job and you should get off the stage. And it's very, very important. And we realized this back in the bad old days when we created the good old days. We realized that the perception of safety is just as important as the reality of safety. Because people, as Jesse has pointed out numerous times on the show, people flee with their feet. They go elsewhere. The statistical numbers do not lie. We're losing good, productive people who create jobs, services, with the taxpayers, the ones who give to the charitable organizations and the cultural institutions and the hospitals and the research centers. We're losing the good people. 800,000 in the last, 4 years, Jesse. What do you say about that?
I can't add anything more to that, Your Honor, because you're absolutely correct. The people are voting. The people are making their displeasure known with their government in the only way they know possible, in the most dramatic and drastic way they know possible. They're leaving. They're leaving for states that respect law and order, that respect the integrity of judges, they respect the integrity of prosecutors, and they respect law enforcement. They want safe communities. They don't want to be beholden to hoodlums. They want to be safely go into buses and subways and trains. They want to safely walk down Main Street and be patronizing these stores. They don't need to be, as Michael said, to be fearful that if you're a woman, you're going to get punched in the face for no reason, just because you decided to take a walk down a city block to maybe grab a bagel or just enjoy this beautiful city that once was. It's rotting at the core, and it's rotting from the inside out. And it's not that anybody's trying to prevent it. These elected officials are infusing the toxins into the core of our apple.
Well, it's interesting because last night on Katz and Cosby, we had Jason Rantz on. Jason is a radio talk show host out in Seattle, and he covers the Northwest section of America. And he's written this book, and the book is about the New York experience writ large. It's not just New York, Jesse. It's all the urban areas where you have the radical progressives who've undermined actual public safety and a perception of public safety, who have diminished the quality of life. And he's very concerned about how hard it is, having lost this, to bring it back. Because people do vote with their feet, and they do leave, and that alters the demographic of the people who are here. Once upon a time, when New York had crisis, they had leaders in the unions, in academia, at City Hall, in the state legislature, in the mayor's office, in the governor's office, bankers, real estate people, smart business people. They all came together to save New York, to make it work. Today, you look around, and to me, the great signal event of our time, not just in New York City, but as Jason Rance pointed out, in Seattle and in Portland and other cities across the country, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Chicago. You have this climate of lawlessness, and there's no sense that there's any strong leadership who gets the obligation to defend and protect the people. Michael, your thoughts?
So there's always the exception that proves the rule. And I like to think a lot about Sherlock Holmes and A Hound of the Baskervilles, because the crime is solved by the dog that doesn't bark. And it's really easy to take for granted what good leadership looks like. It's interesting you mentioned Philadelphia. I actually think that Sherelle Parker is a terrific mayor to be, and we're very encouraged by what she's doing. We own a fair amount of property in North Philadelphia, and the leadership change there I think will be very positive. But for that one, you look across the country at dozens and dozens of cities that have been continually run with the same sort of leadership, political party notwithstanding, that was sort of negative for a really long time. And the economic prosperity in those cities looked like a reverse hockey stick. They've just been in constant decline. You look at a place like Chicago or Portland, and you're like, or Seattle in some ways, how did this happen? New York is the exception that proved the rule. The bad old days of the Dinkins administration, things were pretty bad. There were bad neighborhoods, and economic prosperity here was not booming, to say the least. And then you had Giuliani, Bloomberg. And for 20 years, New York City had moderate, rational leadership that recognized the need to keep your streets safe and to create conditions for prosperity. And during that period of leadership, New York's economic prosperity and the general zeitgeist of the city, right? It was a hockey stick in the right direction. It was so encouraging to see the growth. There were no more bad neighborhoods. There was essentially not a lot of violent crime. You can get on the subway without looking behind you or thinking if you need to be standing near a subway column to avoid being shoved into the tracks. And then we took that 20 years of leadership. We got too sick of winning, and we went the other way, and we had disastrous mayoralty under de Blasio. And the city's now in a very, very hard spot. And if that doesn't teach people about the importance of leadership, New York's trajectory would probably have looked just like that of Baltimore or Chicago or Portland, quite frankly, had it not had that bridge period where we had moderate, competent, safety-first, business-friendly leadership. And there's no one who benefited more from that economic growth than the parts of the city that had previously been forgotten about. And so you think about models of leadership and how important it is to have moderate leadership. New York is the exception that proved that rule, and somehow we forgot about that. And here's hoping we can get back to a place like that, because if we don't, this city's in a lot of trouble.
We have to take a break. This is Let the Record Show. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. With me is my good friend, esteemed colleague, co-host Jesse Garcia, chairman of the Republican Party here in New York, Suffolk County, as well as the vice chair of the state Republican Party, and our guest, the very learned Michael Davis, who's a founding partner of Plymouth Group, an investment firm in venture capital and real estate, as well as the head of the Council for Secure America, a group dedicated to preserving and protecting our institutions and our values. We'll be back in a moment for our final segment of Let the Record Show. Stay tuned.
This is Let the Record Show.
Impact confirmed. The Slayer has been activated.
Demonic threat level increasing.
Hold the line!
All the power of hell cowering before one man.
id Software presents Doom, The Dark Ages. Available now on Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 5, and PC.
Rated M for mature.
Are we still on the trail? Is this pack getting heavier? More switchbacks? Why am I doing this?
At REI Co-op, we believe there are places within ourselves.
Just a little further. You got this.
That we find only outside.
Wow. Look at the stars. This is incredible.
We have the gear, inspiration, and advice to help you get there. REI Co-op. Visit rei.com.
Home means something different to everyone. But with Rocket Mortgage, home can mean even more. It can mean a college education, taming your high-interest debt, even a renovation. We've made it easier than ever to use your home equity. That home you worked so hard for, now it can work hard for you. Call 800-4ROCKET or visit rocket.com to find out more.
Rocket Mortgage, LLC, licensed in all 50 states, and MLSConsumerAccess.org, number 3030.
I already love same-day delivery with Shipt, but it's so much better since I signed up for Target Circle 360. Why? Because I no longer pay price markups from the majority of stores through Shipt. Only a handful of alcohol retailers and items don't count. That means no markups on groceries, pet food, even home goods and makeup. So to recap, I have more time to catch up on life while someone shops for me, and I spend less. It's a win-win. Order now at shipt.com/360. Terms apply.
This is Let the Record Show. Now, here are your hosts, Judge Richard Weinberg and Suffolk County Republican Committee Chairman Jesse Garcia.
Welcome back to Let the Record Show with Chairman Jesse Garcia of the Republican Party. Jesse is the county chair of Suffolk County as well as the vice chair of the state Republican Party. Our guest with us today is Michael Davis, founding partner of Plymouth Group, an investment firm in real estate and venture capital, as well as the head and director of the Council for a Secure America, a group dedicated to preservation of American values and institutions. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. I want to raise another topic. This was some lunch I had, I must say, with Michael. I mean, I just sat there in awe as he just rolled off one brilliant concept after another. And I have to say, this one I thought was even more interesting because he looked at me, he says, how America lost the Cold War. And I said, what? I said, no, we won the Cold War. What do you mean? We lost the post-Cold War. So what did you mean by that, Michael? Would you please straighten me out on this?
So first I have to make a minor correction. I wish I'd gotten to start Council for Secure America. It was actually started by one of my heroes, a great, great man who passed away a number of years ago named Sandy Eisenstadt, who was truly a giant of a man, and Harold Hamm, who helped birth horizontal drilling and American energy independence.
Right, I know Harold Hamm. Right.
So I'm
and Eisenstadt too, of course.
I'm blessed to be in leadership there, but I stand on the shoulders of giants in that organization who were so instrumental in achieving American energy independence, or at least for a while.
That was the good old days.
Exactly, the good old days, before the LNG export bans and all that frivolity. But it's funny, I'd sort of spoken to someone who was an editor at a very prominent periodical who fully rejected this and told me it was, quote, terrible. So I like it anyway. Notwithstanding, I'll sort of share what my thoughts are on what happened after the Cold War and maybe use this a little bit as a framing tool for how we can course correct in this country. If you ask a young person what we were doing in Vietnam, right, not whether it was a good idea or not, intelligent and honest people can have disagreements about policy and implementation of that particular conflict. But we didn't have, this is, I think, provable, we didn't have territorial or resource ambition in that particular conflict. What we were fundamentally fighting against was the idea that this ideology, whether it's neo-Marxism, Marxism, socialism, communism, or any of its twin brothers in all their various manifestations, the idea was that this organizing system for society was taking root around the world, and we were so fearful that if it got to our shores and took root here, that it would overthrow the order of how our country operated. And so we went to war. Whether that was good or bad is a different question. But what happened afterwards in many ways is more instructive. I grew up, like many others, and we were singing the Pledge of Allegiance in school. Very few schools still do that. Very few schools still sort of have this is a great country ethos, the one that my Bubby and Zadie, so to speak, instilled in us growing up. But how lucky we were to live here.
Those are grandparents, is that correct?
Those are grandparents.
Jesse, for you and me, those are grandparents.
That's Yiddish for grandparents. Okay. So they were survivors of the war, and they came here, and every cliche you could imagine about the streets are paved with gold, we certainly heard those growing up, and we believe them to our core. But that love of country that stems from understanding that our system of government is the worst except for all other systems of government, and I think the quotes write themselves. If you understand it through that prism, after we won, right, Reagan says, let's tear down that wall, and then it happens. And the Soviet Union falls, and we win the game. And at that point, we all went back to our regular daily lives of creating value for each other and our families, and we stopped talking about it. But as the saying goes, we might have all the clocks, but they have all the time. And in the decades that have followed since, I think it's pretty hard to objectively turn to the world as it exists today, to the intersectional wokeness that has overtaken, the DEI culture that has overtaken our university systems, the staffers on the Hill where it seems like half the members are afraid of their staffers in many ways, right? Something's gone deeply wrong in the culture because we don't talk about American greatness anymore.
Well, the New York Times ownership is scared of their staff. They just blew off McDaniel from MSNBC because they're afraid of their staff. It took them, 2 days to blow her off. Why? Because there's so much for diversity except for thought.
Look, we'll get to the cost of courage in a moment, which I do think is a through line worth following. But when you step on a rake, it hits you in the face. That's just the nature of things. And I think that we've lost our way pretty deeply in that we gave essentially all of our major cultural, academic, artistic, literary, journalistic institutions to the exact ideology we were fighting over there. I mean, you wouldn't say it's not workers of the world unite anymore. They lost on class, but they're winning seemingly on race, gender, sexuality, and divisiveness, even though most Americans are pretty good about live and let live politics on that stuff. Certainly there are extremes and examples that are not that way, but most people want to respect other people's right to live the lives they want. That really is the American dream. It was never money. It was always freedom. And those freedoms feel abridged in many ways. You can't say what you think anymore publicly because you're going to get canceled, right? You'll offend your political overlord or your investors or gosh knows who. And whether or not your ideas are good, a culture that causes people to self-silence is a culture in decline. That's a deeply unhealthy thing. And so the thesis is we won that war, but in its aftermath, we stopped playing the game and they didn't. And so ultimately, many of those ideas that we were hoping wouldn't take root, they won without firing a shot, because go to Harvard and you'll be like, it's hard to say that we won.
Well, remember that debate between Romney and Obama, where Romney was pointing out the dangers of Russia, and that's the external threat, but you've been just alluding to, Michael, the internal threat in terms of the education and the values instilled or not instilled in our young people. But Obama very condescendingly, in the most superior manner that he always had great effect in doing, and people thought it was just wonderful. He said, the Cold War is over. Even when he said it, I said, I can't vote for this guy. He doesn't understand the nature of the people out there, that there's such a thing as evil, and we have to be ready to confront it. Obama missed the point. Mitt Romney understood that point.
Well, when he said Russia's our greatest foe and Obama laughed at him on the stage, that was sort of a low light. But you really have to think more broadly, like, do you love this country? What do you teach your kids about it? We get a lot wrong. I think about like how we teach Thanksgiving to little kids today. To be clear, wrongs were done to the Native Americans, wrongs that deserve forms of recompense and intentionality and thought that are ongoing exercises. But if you don't give context to someone first, which is here's the story of our country, let them love it first and then tell them what's wrong with it, ultimately you're painting the country in a brush where John Q. Young person will be like, yeah, I don't love this country that much. You hear that often enough, that refrain from young people, and you sort of look at all the people coming up against the border who I think are making, we get to debate about policy, but for someone coming from a really tough place, getting a correct signal that the gates are open and having a chance at a better life, they're responding pretty intelligently to that stimulus. They're going to get a better life for their family. So there's something that's sort of a cognitive dissonance, and the people who are here think this place is so terrible, but the rest of the world is still trying pretty hard to get in because, at least for now, we're still free, and that freedom is the greatest source of goodness and wealth creation and prosperity and happiness the world has ever known. And I'll finish with, this is not an obvious state of being. The state of the world historically, for like all of world history, except for this little blip in Western civilization, is for people to be controlled. Central control is the default. It is the norm. The American experiment, and we'll get to Washington in a moment, the American experiment that the people will govern, that civics means that law has to originate in the part of Congress most frequently accountable to its constituents and balanced by population, all this is done to create these checks and balances so that the people can be self-determinative. That's a really magical state of the world, and it's not natural. What Putin and Xi are doing is much more in keeping with the natural course of the world than this experiment in self-governance and freedom. And I prefer the self-governance and freedom, and I think all of us really need to be careful that it's more fragile than anybody realizes, and it can come apart if you don't take care of it.
Jesse, your thoughts?
Off air, we jokingly said, what I was going to bring up about the fact that I thought we won the Cold War, but we lost the post-Cold War peace. And, Michael, you brought up something, I wanted to bring up a couple of things. I think what happened is we had, as you said, we stopped fighting. We stopped fighting, and the other ones kept, and our enemies kept the battle going on. But after 8 years of Obama and now 4 years of Biden, that's 12 years of appeasement on the world stage that has really set us back. It has put America on an apology tour. It has created a vacuum where American leadership on the global stage is no longer there. We are not feared. We're not respected. We're not counted upon. And I believe that has a problem with the fact that we've lost the Cold War peace. And you brought up something that myself and the judge and other guests have brought up over the year that we've been on air. And it dawned on me as you said it. It's happening. I do agree that social media is a big proponent of this. But what also has happened, in my, very, basic opinion, is that it started with academia, with the higher education in colleges, universities, where our young people were being indoctrinated instead of educated. And now it's seeping into our high schools and our middle schools. We're not being proficient in reading, writing, or arithmetic and social studies anymore. It's more about, social engineering and transgender and all these other type of issues that are not relevant right now to someone who's in elementary school and is incapable of really truly understanding. And I do believe that that's where we are failing and where our enemies have been succeeding. You mentioned TikTok. Right now it's unfortunate that, our faces and our noses are more in our phones than we are in speaking to a person next to us. And you know what, dare I say, I'm guilty of that too from time to time. More times than I should be, let me say. And that is where our enemies are now seeping into our young people and into our society. So I agree, as we were discussing off air, and I listened intently to you, that we lost the Cold War peace, and we need to stabilize. And you know what? I go back, I'm the Republican here. So you expect me to talk about Trump and talk about Republican policies. And I do believe in them fervently. But I will tell you, as someone whose family left tyranny and oppression of Cuba for freedom and liberty, like my father did, and I lived through tough Republican leaderships. I grew up with Ronald Reagan. I was there through George Bush, W. Bush, who led us through and the aftermath of 9/11, and had the tough talk and was attacked for his tough talk. And then, of course, through Donald Trump. We may not agree with the language he used, or maybe it was too brash, or maybe it was too common. Maybe it's the talk of bars and kitchen tables and restaurants as opposed to diplomats. But at least America was respected, and our enemies weren't surrounding us at that point. And we were holding back and maybe, dare I say, winning the Cold War peace. We're not doing that now.
Michael.
Jesse, to your point, COVID was instructive because parents were at home watching their kids on Zoom and for the first time in a long time seeing what they were learning. And I think most of them were pretty concerned. And in the aftermath of that, there's been a huge push for follow the student funding models and alternative educational models because people are obviously concerned with what and how their kids are learning. And I think many parents just assumed that the educational experiences they had, this is true from elementary all the way up through the university level, that the schools that they went to, the buildings are the same buildings, but that they were learning the same things, and the experiences that their children were having were similar. And I think most of them were caught pretty unawares. The magic moment of Elsie Stefanik's hearing on anti-Semitism was instructive in this way, where three very brilliant women, right, leading MIT, Harvard, and Penn, these are serious institutions, who had been coached at length by counsel, couldn't answer the question of, is calling for the genocide of Jews against the code of conduct? And Elsie Stefanik, I think, will be the first to tell you, that was her setup question. That was the easy question. That was the layup, which is, yeah, of course that would not be okay. And the second question will be, well, then what do you think of this? And I think the world was pretty taken aback that somehow this group of people had become so open-minded their brains were falling out. They had lost the ability to understand that regular people listening to this, it sounded crazy because in the ivory towers, the sort of Gordian knot of intersectional ideologies had been well enough developed that they forgot that this is not where the people are, which is why you look at polling and some of the policy you see and the tone deafness of announcing Transgender Individual Recognition Day on the holiest day of the Christian calendar, right? There's something going wrong in the translational layer between where people are and aren't. And I think some of that does get to your point, and I apologize I'm going on for a while, Jesse, about courage. So the nature of social media and being on our phones, I will tell you, my favorite thing about my life is that we are Sabbath observant. And even though some of the ritual stuff becomes challenging and waking up and getting to synagogue isn't the most fun and walking there in the rain, the off button that's built into our lives and the lives of the friends who we spend our Shabbat meals with is magic because our kids are not on their phones either. They're playing outside and they're doing their thing. But when you think about how social media works, there's a psychological phenomenon at play. So one of my dear friends is a guy named Todd Rose, who runs a think tank called Populous, who studies collective illusions at societal scale. And the idea is that the voice repeated most often at the highest volume with the most frequency becomes a manufactured consensus. That it doesn't reflect what people think. The emperor, so to speak, has no clothes, but you think that everybody else thinks it because it's the loudest voice. And what happens is if you go on the internet today and you say, for example, something about Israel's right to defend itself against the brutality of savages who raped, murdered, and killed and are still, to this moment, holding hostages, that sort of somehow keeps leaving the conversation. If you say that on the internet, there's a 1,000% certainty you're going to get dogpiled by the bad guys. It's definitely going to happen. They're coming at you. But no one's going to say anything nice. And so what's been engineered is a very negative dopamine feedback loop. So if you say a good thing about Israel or America's relationship with Israel, the right of democracies to defend themselves against terror, regardless of some really challenging costs, and I'm in no way minimizing those, if you say that, right, the courage to have this conversation on a show or to say that publicly is you're going to be pilloried and dogpiled for doing that, but there's no positive feedback loop. And so most people just choose in a culture like that in many ways to self-silence. And the repercussions of that across society is this dissonance between what people believe and their silence. It speaks to why Trump won in 2016 in many ways, right? You wouldn't tell a pollster you were going to vote for him because if you said that, you were a racist, homophobic, xenophobic person. And so we lose the ability to measure what the population thinks about something when we set conditions, and social media just exacerbates that at scale because most people just don't want to step on that landmine.
Well, let me go back, and then I want to get Jesse's thoughts on this. I want to go back to the New York Times and MSNBC and, of course, the other mass media and the big tech companies. The conformity that goes on amongst the young staffers in terms of their values, who they talk to, what they read, how they reinforce themselves in the same bubble. They're not willing. They keep talking about diversity, but it's not diversity of thought. They don't sit there and have a conversation with somebody who has a different point of view. They're not willing to have somebody else be in the studio with them as, the Morning Joe people so proudly and self-righteously said, we're not going to allow that person to be on. We'll never have her on the show. How awful to have somebody like that who thinks like that. Well, maybe you might learn something about who those people are and what their values are, and maybe there's value to their values. But the unwillingness to listen to somebody else and the drive to conformity of thought and expression is positively Orwellian. The Orwellian nightmare of conformity by silence, which is what Michael has just been talking about. And Jesse, you understand that as a son of someone who escaped that kind of Orwellian nightmare in Castro's Cuba, understand that better than anybody, that conformity degrades life, brings no joy, and that's why people were trying to climb over the Berlin Wall and being shot at to get out. That's why people went on boats to get out of Cuba, to get here, because they wanted the freedom. And it's not just the economic opportunity. It's what both of you gentlemen alluded to before. It's the opportunity to think and worship and talk freely. Jesse.
You're absolutely right. And, I do believe that progressives, the woke, the people who engage in cancel culture, They love to be the loudest, but they truly are the most cowardly because they will yell, scream, and protest to have a different opinion within their midst, within their sphere, because they can't compete with those. They can't debate those ideals. They can't debate the points, the issues, the matters between Ron and McDaniel and the MSNBC or the NBC liberals, because they will lose all the time. You know, whether you like her leadership or not, Ron and McDaniel comes from a place of common sense, Republican philosophies of freedom, liberty, self-governance. Those are evil words for the people at NBC and liberals and woke in the cancel culture. But the thing is, you can't debate it. You can shout it down. You can try and shout it down, but you can't debate it. That's why they don't want to be on the same stage with them, because they'll lose the argument every time. That's why all the leaders, they can't win elections, but they'll change constantly the rules of the game to benefit them. When ideas don't work, manipulate the process. That's exactly what they do.
That's exactly right. Well, this has been a great conversation, Jesse and Michael. I want to thank you both very much. I want to thank our listeners for listening. I hope you understand that we stand for freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and the great American values that made this country the greatest experiment in human dignity in the history of the world. This has been Let the Record Show. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg with our great guest, Michael Davis, and my good friend, esteemed colleague, co-host, Jesse Garcia, chairman of the Republican Party. Gentlemen, thank you once again. God bless you both, and God bless America.
Let the Record Show is on the air.